You've heard this one before. A shark, somewhere out in the open ocean, picks up the faintest trace of blood, and from miles away, it turns, locks on, and begins the hunt. It's one of the most repeated facts about the ocean's most feared predator. It's also, according to the actual science, mostly wrong. Let's start with the part that's true, because sharks really do have an extraordinary sense of smell, one of the most sensitive of any animal on Earth. Researchers have measured shark olfactory sensitivity at concentrations as low as 1 part per million, and in some species, for certain chemical compounds, down to 1 part in several billion. To put that second number in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to detecting a single drop of a substance dissolved in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That number alone is genuinely remarkable. It's also exactly where the myth starts to run away from the facts. Because incredibly sensitive and able to detect something from miles away are not the same claim, and mixing them up is where the entire sharks can smell blood a mile away legend comes from. Sensitivity tells you how dilute a scent a shark can detect if that scent actually reaches its nose. It says nothing about how far that scent can travel through open water to reach the shark in the toin's first place. So let's separate those two things properly, because understanding the difference is the key to this whole story. First, how does a shark actually smell? Unlike you, a shark isn't pulling water in through its nostrils to breathe. Sharks breathe through their gills entirely separately. Their nostrils, called nares, exist purely for detecting scent. Water flows in through one opening, passes over a folded structure called the olfactory rosette, packed with thousands of sensory cells, and exits through another opening, all without touching the shark's mouth or throat at all. It's a dedicated smell-only system, and in many species, it's connected to an enormous portion of the brain specifically devoted to processing scent, larger relative to brain size than almost anything found in mammals. Here's a detail that consistently surprises people. Sharks can even tell which nostril a smell hit first, using that tiny timing difference, sometimes measured in fractions of a second, to figure out which direction the scent is coming from, the same basic principle your ears use to figure out where a sound came from. It's an extraordinarily precise directional sense, built entirely around chemistry instead of sound or light. So the sensitivity is real. The directional tracking ability is real. But now here's where physics gets in the way of the legend. For a shark to detect blood from a mile away, that blood would need to travel a full mile through open ocean water, in a high enough concentration to still register at 1 part per million or lower by the time it arrived. All without being torn apart, diluted, and scattered by ocean currents, mixing water layers and turbulence along the way. And that's simply not how scent works in a fluid as dynamic as the open ocean. Marine biologists studying this have found that under real, ideal ocean conditions, a steady current, minimal turbulence, and a substantial source of blood in the water, a shark's practical detection range tops out at somewhere around a few hundred meters, with some studies suggesting a rare upper limit of roughly a quarter mile under the most favorable circumstances imaginable. Not a mile, not the whole bay. A quarter mile, at the extreme edge, and only when everything about the current and water conditions lines up perfectly. Why does the myth persist then, if actual marine biology has been saying otherwise for decades? Because the true number is still genuinely impressive on its own, and popular culture, from movies to Shark Week specials, found the exaggerated version simply more dramatic. A shark can detect a drop of blood in an area the size of a swimming pool. Doesn't last quite as terrifying in a trailer as a shark can smell you bleeding from a mile away. One version sells fear more efficiently than the other, even though the modest version is the one that's actually true. There's another piece of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it matters just as much as the range itself. Smell is only one of several senses a shark uses to locate prey, and for most of the hunt, it isn't even the primary one. At longer distances, sharks rely heavily on hearing. Sound travels remarkably fast and far underwater, and sharks are extremely sensitive to the low-frequency vibrations produced by an injured or struggling animal, often detecting those sounds from much farther away than they could ever detect a scent. As a shark closes in, its lateral line system, a row of pressure-sensitive receptors running along its body, picks up on subtle changes in water movement. And in the final few feet of an approach, sharks switch to something almost no other predator on Earth relies on: electroreception, detecting the faint electrical fields generated by every living creature's muscle contractions through specialized organs called the ampullae of Lorenzini. Smell, in other words, isn't the opening move in a shark's hunting sequence. It's one instrument in an entire orchestra of senses, most useful in the middle distance, well after sound has already done the heavy lifting of getting a shark's attention in the first place. So why does this particular myth matter enough to spend an entire video correcting it? Because it's done real, measurable damage to how people understand and fear one of the ocean's most important predators. The smells blood for miles myth feeds directly into the idea that sharks are constantly, actively hunting down anything bleeding in the water, scanning vast stretches of ocean specifically for human blood. In reality, the odds of a shark encounter after a minor injury in the water remain extremely low. Statistically, you are far more likely to be struck by lightning in your lifetime than killed by a shark. The exaggerated version of this myth has shaped decades of unnecessary fear, influenced fishing and conservation policy debates, and contributed to the mass killing of sharks, whose populations, in many species, are now genuinely at risk. The real science tells a more interesting story anyway. Not a predator with supernatural, boundless senses, but an animal with a precisely tuned, remarkably sensitive detection system operating within real physical limits, using multiple overlapping senses working together in sequence. That's not a less impressive shark. If anything, it's a far more accurate and far more fascinating picture of what evolution actually built. So the next time someone tells you a shark can smell a drop of your blood from a mile out, you'll know the more precise, more interesting version of the truth. It's not about how far the scent could theoretically travel. It's about how astonishingly little of it a shark needs once it actually arrives.